Hello everybody, welcome to chapter 1 of Anatomy and Physiology. And so we're going to be diving right in and we're going to be starting talking about form and function in anatomy and physiology. So the first thing is to kind of start from the very basic definition. So anatomy, of course, is the study of the structure of the body parts and those relationships to one another. And physiology is the study of the function of the body parts. So you can think of anatomy as what you're seeing and the structure, the parts, and physiology is more of how it works. Anatomy, what it is, physiology, how it works. And so that's something that's sort of fundamental. In this class, we'll be doing both. We'll be learning the anatomy, the anatomical structures, the positions, and things like that, and be moving on into, as well, at roughly the same time, how each of these parts or systems work, and in some cases how these work together. So some of the main subdivisions of anatomy. So we can think of anatomy and physiology as this whole broad area, right? Well, there's subdivisions of it, and some people work in some areas of anatomy, and some people work in physiology, and some do these little sub areas in which they study or work. The first one is gross anatomy, or what we call macroscopic anatomy. So gross anatomy is just a study of the large visible structures. Things like the regional anatomy, which looks at all the structures in a particular area of the body. You could also have in the gross anatomy maybe a system anatomy, which looks at just one system. So maybe someone is an expert in the gross anatomy of the cardiovascular system or the muscular system or the nervous system. So understanding the components of that. We also have surface anatomy. So surface anatomy looks at these internal structures as they relate to overlaying skin, such as visible muscle masses or veins seen on the surface. So of course, while gross anatomy covers these outward structures, you might see some that are maybe looking regionally or systemic as opposed to just the entire system. Some other subdivisions, of course, are microscopic anatomy. That should make sense in the sense that we can't see these things with the naked eye. So we basically have to go in and sort of use a microscope or something to allow us to visualize those parts of anatomy. Things like cytology is a field under microscopic anatomy. Things like, which cytology is the study of the cells. So studying those cell structures. You'll learn there are over 250 different cell types. We'll be talking about that soon. So a cytologist has a lot of work to do because it's not just like we have 3 or 4 different cell types. We have hundreds of them. And then, of course, histology. That's the study of those tissues. So we have lots of tissues. When we get to chapter 4, actually in the same module, we'll be actually studying a little bit about those tissues as well. So we'll get into those things like blood and bone and epithelial tissue and things like that. And then, of course, there's developmental anatomy. So that just sort of studies those anatomical and physiological development through life. So understanding how the body changes from birth to death, the aging process, and what happens to these anatomical structures as we age. One of the areas under this, of course, is embryology, and that's the study of the developments before birth. So studying those stages of development while the child is in the womb, while the child is a fetus. And so basically understanding the different stages of development that a fetus will actually go through. So basically, to study anatomy, you must know not only the anatomical terminology and be able to observe, manipulate, things like that. You need to be able to see what the structure is and know what the structure is. And that helps us when there's an abnormality or something wrong. We can tell, hey, there's something not quite right about this here because, I know this certain shape or this certain structure to be true for this certain system. And if it's not correct or if there's something wrong, you can visually see that. But not only knowing the names of things as well. Now, physiology, too, is complex in and of itself. So we basically can, at least in human physiology and mammalian physiology, we tend to base those on organ systems. So you'll notice as after we get past the tissues and stuff like that, we'll start diving into and talking about each system independently. The muscular system, the skeletal system, the cardiovascular system. So we will divide it just like physiology divides it. So we divide physiology, especially like I said, human physiology, based on organ systems. So you might have a renal system, or physiology, cardiovascular physiology. And so when we talk about it, however, even though we're looking at physical systems, the entire organ system, it often focuses on very specific cell and molecular levels of the body. So what we look at in physiology is maybe understanding something that happens in the body or some body ability that we have is dependent upon some chemical reaction in an individual cell. So that makes physiology very complex and complicated. So in this class, Anatomy and Physiology, you're just scratching the surface. This is just sort of survey intro course to physiology. If you were to major in biology or go to medical school or something like that, you would dive deeper into some of these chemical reactions and how they make these processes work. So really, to study physiology, you must understand sort of basic physical principles. So not only do you need to understand biology, you have to understand physics to understand electrical currents, pressure, movement, as well as chemistry, understanding those basic chemical properties, things that allow molecules to interact with each other, things that allow chemical reactions to proceed. What do enzymes? We'll learn about enzymes later. But enzymes are just these little proteins that make chemical reactions go faster. So sometimes some of the reactions in our body won't happen at all unless we have an enzyme there to help push it along. Or it would take too long to finish, so that enzyme helps it along. So a physiologist would look deep down to try to understand those basic chemical principles that helps a reaction to occur or helps something to progress. So physiology, even just like anatomy, is quite complex. Now, of course, there are some ideas that there is complementary features between structure and function. So the structure of something indicates sometimes how it works. And we haven't talked about DNA because we just started this class, but in DNA, that's exactly what Watson and Crick thought. They said if we could figure out the shape of DNA, its shape would tell us how it worked. And they were right. And in anatomy and physiology, that works just the same. So when we see a structure, sometimes that structure helps us understand its function. And so they are inseparable, anatomy and physiology. They work together. So a function always, in some ways, reflects that structure. So what structure can do really depends upon its physical form. And so that's something how we're going to be able to tell how something looks and how it works and to make those comparisons. We call this the principle of complementarity in structure and function in anatomy. I just typically say, structure leads us to function. It's easier to say, but that's sort of what we define that as. But really they're inseparable. And when we see something, a lot of times just looking at it can give us clues on how it actually works. So some complementary structures and things like that. You can think of your teeth and in your mouth. So basically, you have sharp edges of your incisors. You look at those structures. You see them. You see those sharp edges. And then, of course, we have some flat surfaces of our molars. Well, these sharp edges of your incisors, because they're sharp, just looking at them, you could tell you could bite down on something, or you could saw through something or break down something, right? So looking at its sort of structure tells you, ooh, if something is clamped down on, it'll break a piece off. And molars, they have that flat area on them. And so basically these flat surfaces, that structure tells us, ooh, we could probably use that to grind and mash. And so that's sort of what you can see. Just by looking at something, you can start to see what it does. Now, we have a little bit of firsthand experience, right? Because we've done this since we've been chewing since we started eating solid foods. And so this is something that we've done, and so we know. But you can imagine this being applied to a structure you may not understand or have seen much before, right? If you had never seen this sharp instrument, just by looking at it and kind of manipulating it with your hands, you probably could figure out how to work with it. And so that's where we get that structure and function and that unity. Now, in anatomy and physiology, you heard me mention a minute ago that, to be a physiologist, for example, you have to understand physics and you have to understand chemistry and biology, and all these things come together. Well, anatomy and physiology, in its structure, even shows us how integrated the sciences and even math are. We may not touch on as much math in this class, but how unified each thing is. And so, of course, when we're talking about anatomy and physiology, we start at the smallest level. You can think the entire system builds upon itself. And we start with those atoms, those individual units. When those interact with one another, they form those molecules. And the molecules we'll find are very, very important in biological function. And so we'll see a lot of these molecules interacting in different parts of the body when we start talking about physiology. As these molecules interact, you start building things like organelles that will eventually create those cells that we need. So we have all these individual cells. In this case, what this is giving you is an example of the muscular system. And so one of the main organelles that plays a huge role in our muscular system is the mitochondria. And this is an organelle called the mitochondria. And you might have heard of it before. A lot of times when you define the mitochondria, you might hear the term, it's the powerhouse of the cell. Well, basically the mitochondria, it's that, because it actually breaks down sugar in order to generate ATP, adenosine triphosphate, in order that we can utilize for energy. So it just changes the structure of the food we eat, the sugar, and basically gives us usable energy in the form of ATP. The muscle cells, in particular, all of our cells, basically, if it's a multicellular, with the exception of the blood cell, but basically all of these have these mitochondria, right? The mitochondria are present in all these cells. However, in our muscle cells, they are higher in number. That should make sense, right? Because if we have these mitochondria that help generate the ATP that we utilize for energy, then our muscle cells, we need a lot of energy for movement, right? We need to pick up things. We need to walk. We need to hold our body weight. We need all kinds of stuff. So basically, that muscle cell needs to have a lot of mitochondria. So all those mitochondria interacting amongst, DNA and all this other stuff gives us these muscle cells. Muscle cells, when those cells start interacting, they start forming a tissue. So you can see here's some muscle tissue. So when cells group together, start cooperating and working together, you get that whole systemic tissue. When those tissues work together, in this case, they're showing you smooth muscle tissue. Basically, when they start working together, then you start getting basically entire organs. Those organs come together, they work together. So you might have things like a blood vessel that runs through, that's made up of these tissues, which would then work all together to form that entire organ system. And so the organ system is all that entire system working together. And then what we'll learn is that these organ systems themselves work together as well. And that gives us that overall organism, essentially, or the person. So that is able to kick a soccer ball or is able to do what they need to do in order to function. So we start with these basic atoms that interact with one another, and we start building. And each of these pieces start working together to form this entire system. So even just looking at these levels of structural organization, you can see here that it's a very complex system, right? Because you have to have lots of different cells working together to give you this unique tissue. Eventually, you'll need different tissues that work together to create organs, right? Then you'll need these different organs to work together to create these interactive, harmonious organ systems to create this being. And so when we'll study these systems, typically in anatomy and physiology, independent of one another, for the most part. But the one thing that you need to remember is we may one day be talking about, and this won't come until Anatomy 2, but you may be talking about the digestive system in, one day, and then the next day talking about the endocrine system, and the next day talking about something else, another system. But what we don't really always feature is that they work together. And so while we may study them independent of one another, really they function because they work as a unit in our body, right? So some of those necessary functions that our systems will do for us is to kind of keep us alive, right? So we have these requirements for life. So we have to constantly, our body is constantly working to keep us alive. So there's functions all throughout the body that is keeping us going or keeping us functioning the way we need to. So we are undergoing this constant bombardment of maintenance. And that's just normal. That's what happens. So one thing we have to do is we have to be able to move. So our muscles must be able to work, and our skeletal system has to do what it needs to do. We have to be able to compartmentalize, maintain different boundaries within our body system. We have to be able to be responsive to the environment, whether the responsiveness is a response to a stimuli on the outside, such as I touch a hot stove, my nervous system needs to quickly, very rapidly tell me I'm burning, right? So I can jerk it away. So it's constantly having to tell us, but it also has to respond at the molecular level too. So if there's something in the body that is, maybe there's not enough of a certain compound that is flowing through the body, my body has to adjust that up or down to make sure I have enough of that. Digestion, of course, there's a lot of chemical processes that are involved in digestion. And of course, digestion starts at the mouth when we start masticating. We also have these chemicals in our mouth that will help start breaking down that process. And then, of course, we go through that digestive process. But if we have a problem, really our body has to keep the digestive system maintained, right? If you have an ulcer or something like that, it damages the lining of your stomach, creating that burning, painful situation. Your stomach is constantly having to heal itself and maintaining so that digestion can occur. Metabolism. You have to be able to break down these foods into usable forms of energy. We don't create energy. Remember, in physics, energy is not created or destroyed. We have to change its form or use it in a different way. And so in this case, metabolism helps us reform that from the food that we eat, such as glucose, and reshape that into things like ATP so that we can utilize that for our everyday function. Excretion is also important because we have to be able to, when we process all the food we eat, we're going to have some leftover material, and we have to be able to get that out, right? If we can't, it would back up and we would have, basically die from being, poisoned to death. So basically, our body not only has to excrete the stuff, it has to make sure when it excretes it properly. And then, of course, some obvious ones too are reproduction and growth. We have to be able to grow in that productive way, in that organized fashion. And then, of course, reproduction in order to carry on those systems. There's a lot of maintenance in reproduction. There's checkpoints that the body goes through at the time and before you have intercourse. When the sperm and egg unite, there's checkpoints. After they unite, there's checkpoints to make sure everything's okay. And so we will see that in order to live, not only do we have to do these things, we have to checks and balance those things as well. So kind of an obvious statement, but humans are multicellular organisms. So basically, to function, the individual cells must be kept alive because those individual cells, right, have to work together in order to give us this interactive system that we have. So all organ systems are designed to service the cells. So when something needs to, happen, our organ systems are working to basically keep that cellular level functioning. And that should make sense because, those cells, those basic cells, if you remember back, and I'll go back that slide real quick. If you go back here, I said these mitochondria in the muscle cells, there's a ton of mitochondria in here that give us the energy so that we can kick this ball. So our systems have to work to make sure that that cell can produce, that mitochondria inside that cell can produce that ATP so that we can do what we need to do. So these organ systems literally help make each of our cells function so that we can function. So essentially all cells depend upon organ systems to meet their survival needs. If the system fails, those cells fail, and then we're in trouble, right? So there are 11 organ systems that work together to maintain life. We'll kind of quickly go through some of those, and they all work with each other, right? But basically, one that we have is the digestive system. The digestive system, of course, food comes in, wastes come out. That's obviously something that's really important with regards to nourishment, getting that stuff, that food's in our body so that we can utilize that and break that down into ATP and function, and also absorb those vitamins and things that and minerals that we need for our body. We also have the integumentary system. The integumentary system basically serves as a protection mechanism. If you think of it, it's our skin. It's outward. It's one of the it's basically the largest system in our body. So the integumentary system, pretty important. We'll start off talking about the integumentary system when we get into systems. We have the cardiovascular system of course, that helps pump the blood through our system, distributes oxygen and nutrients throughout the cells. So they really work, together. The respiratory system, of course, is, trying to get oxygen in and the waste products and carbon dioxide out. And then, of course, the urinary system. But you're seeing this image here. It's trying to show you how they're united with one another. All these systems have to work together in order to go through our daily functions for us to survive. Our digestive system depends upon our integumentary system. We cannot take in food to digest if we didn't have our skin outside and our openings in our mouth and things like that. Our circulatory system couldn't work if the nutrients that were absorbed through the intestines couldn't be absorbed into that circulatory system, because that's how we distribute those nutrients throughout the body, including oxygen and things like that. The respiratory system, the circulatory system and the respiratory system rely heavily upon each other, right? So that cardiovascular system requires oxygen to be delivered to it from the respiratory system so that it can distribute it through the body. And of course, the respiratory system, needs the circulatory system to move it, but not only to get that carbon dioxide back, and so that we can expel it out. We couldn't expel oxygen out, carbon dioxide out and oxygen in if we didn't have the integumentary system. So you can see, and you can just look at this diagram and see how important it is that all of these things interact. So like I said a few slides ago, just because we talk about these systems independent of one another does not necessarily mean that they are independent. To exist, they must work together. And those cells work together, the organ systems work together. Of course, I've mentioned some of this before, but the integumentary system, that's the skin, the hair, the nails, things like that, forms the external body covering. It will protect any deeper tissues from injury. Of course, it's also important in synthesizing vitamin D, and we need vitamin D to help us absorb calcium. So, some people talk about a lot, drinking milk or something like that, or consuming things that have calcium. Well, the problem is we can absorb all the calcium in the world, but it won't be absorbed if it doesn't have its cofactor, vitamin D. So we need vitamin D in order to help that actually be able to, that calcium to be absorbed. So if you consume all kinds of calcium, take a calcium supplement or consume it in some way, but don't get vitamin D, either through a supplement or actually synthesize it through exposure to sunlight, it won't be absorbed, and it's kind of pointless, right? Or it won't be absorbed in enough amounts. So, basically, even if we consume through the digestive system calcium, our skin needs to be there to help absorb that vitamin D. So the integumentary does a lot of things. There's all kinds of sweat and oil glands here as well. Our hair and nails are part of this system too. So very large, important system. The skeletal system is next. Of course, that's pretty obvious. It helps not only protect and support the organs, but it does provide this framework for movement and structure as well. Blood cells also are formed within the bones. And basically, that's important. We need our blood cells for a lot of reasons, and our cardiovascular system is going to utilize that. But the blood is actually formed in there, so we need those. Also, bones will store those minerals that we need. You heard me mention calcium before, amongst other things that it's going to absorb. But the skeletal system, of course, is important and works, with other systems like we talked about. Okay, so the next one is the muscular system. Muscular system does allow for that manipulation in the environment. It allows us to move, allows us to change our facial expressions, pick things up, put things down. It helps us maintain posture. We can utilize it to edit our posture. It also produces heat. And so our body will release heat. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the muscular system and how that works. But that's another system that we'll be talking about. The nervous system, basically that is sort of that fast-acting control system, responding to the internal and external environment, activating muscles and glands, things that you need. And so we'll talk, a little bit about what that does. But again, all of these work together. Now, the one thing I want to say for Anatomy 1, when we're studying for A&P 1, our course stops here. Basically, Anatomy 1 covers not only the cells, the tissues and stuff, but it covers the integumentary system, the skeletal system, the muscular system, and the nervous system. So that's where this class will end. But I'll keep talking about, sort of as an intro, the rest of the systems that you're going to encounter when you get to Anatomy 2. So Anatomy 2, you kind of start off talking about the endocrine system. Now, the endocrine system, it has the glands that secrete hormones that help regulate growth, reproduction, our nutrient use, or how fast or slow metabolism is in our body. And, of course, this works throughout the cells. And you'll see here in this image, you see all these different glands that are associated with that system. And we'll learn about those, but you won't learn about those until Anatomy 2. The cardiovascular system, of course, blood vessels that transport blood, carries the oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, waste, etc. The heart is the main engine that runs that and, of course, pumps the blood, as you know. The lymphatic system, of course, that's sort of that, it picks up any fluid that is leaked from the blood vessels, returns it to the blood. It actually disposes of debris in that lymphatic system. It houses the white blood cells, or what we call the lymphocytes, that are involved in immunity. And, of course, it helps us with that immune response, distributes things to sites of infection or injury or something like that. We also have the respiratory system, of course, keeps the blood constantly supplied with oxygen. It removes carbon dioxide. These exchanges occur through these little sacs called alveoli, and they're very, very thin sacs, almost one cell thick at the end, that allows the gas exchange to occur. The digestive system, of course, breaks down the food into those absorbable units that enter the blood for distribution. Also, the urinary system, of course, eliminates these nitrogenous wastes from the body, helps regulate water and electrolyte balance, helps with the acid-base balance of the blood as well. And, of course, we have the reproductive system. So you have the male and female reproductive systems. For the most part, what you will see until you get to the reproductive system, and specifically it will be the same until you hit the reproductive system for males and females. So our body systems we'll be referring to in general. And then, of course, when we get to the reproductive systems, we will have the male and female reproductive system. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I keep going back to the urinary system, and I meant to go to the male and female reproductive systems. So another thing that we'll talk about as we kind of go through is the survival needs that we need in order to function daily, essentially. So we need several factors that must be in these appropriate amounts. eat too much of them or too little of them can be harmful. A lot of times we think about having too little of something as being bad. Not enough food, we're malnourished, or, not enough water, we're dehydrated. But we can have too much as well. So some things that we look at, we got to balance out in our body are our nutrients, our oxygen, our water, our body temperature, and our atmospheric pressure. So those are some of those survival needs. So in the next part of this chapter, we'll talk about a little bit about the orientation. So we'll start diving into anatomical terms, the positions and directional terms. Now, this is where anatomy and physiology kind of gets hard for some students. So for example, a lot of it is when you get to the anatomy, it's just you having to sit down and learn it. There's not a whole lot that I can teach you other than show you where it is. Outside of that, there's no lecture. There is you sitting down and learning them, taking a look at those pieces and memorizing where they are, knowing what they do. Where I can come in is teach you the physiology of how it works. So when we talk about this, you might see some of these chapters, I may go through very, very quickly, because I might say, here, you're just going to have to memorize and look where this structure is and know where it is. And then when it comes to the physiology, I might elaborate more. So this is where it can get complicated for students, because you're waiting for me to lecture on where the fibula is. Well, there's not much that I could show you where it is. Outside of that, you have to learn it. So kind of bear with me. When I start talking about some of these things that you need to learn its position or where it is, there's not much lecture I can give you on that. You just got to find it and do it. And memorize it, and you got it. And then I'll talk a little bit and supplement with physiology. So standard anatomical position, the body is erect, feet slightly apart, palms facing forward with the thumbs pointing away from the body. And you'll have some pictures I'll show you here in a minute. Directional terms, we basically will describe one body structure in relation to another body structure. So direction is always based on standard anatomical position. So when we're talking about this direction here, right, we are basing it on this normal standard anatomical position. So your body is erect, feet slightly apart, palms facing forward, thumbs pointing away. So if I'm telling you to locate something on the body, you have to look for it based on anatomical position. Not the way something is pointed in a different direction, but look at it where it is in anatomical position. Right and left always refer to the body that's being viewed, not the right and left of the observer. So remember, we're looking at this in standard anatomical position, and you're looking at this as the body that is being viewed. This is very complicated for some students. And I'll honestly tell you, if this makes you feel better, this has always been very hard for me. For me, I'm dyslexic. So I don't do well with movement of structures in my head, trying to visualize it. Words and letters move for me too, but also trying to reverse an image in my head is very difficult. So how did I overcome that? Just a lot of practice. It's just a lot of practice, and sometimes I have to slow it down. I'm like, oh, what side is that on? Slow down, think, it's there. So, if this is a struggle for you, that's okay. It's a struggle for a lot of people, and some people it's even more of a struggle. Some people can pick it up really quickly, and some people it takes a little more time. That's okay. We're all in it together. So if you're struggling, my tip is slow it down in your head. Remember what the standard anatomical position is. Get used to viewing that in your mind. You're visualizing it, where things are located. Close your eyes. Try to remember where things are. And always remember your left and right are for the body that's being viewed, not your left and right. So that's another thing that you could just slow down and picture. Think about it when we're talking about these anatomical terms. So first thing we're going to talk about is orientation and directional terms. Okay, superior, sometimes cranial. Basically, that's towards the head end or upper part of the structure or the body or above. It means above. So an example is showing you with an arrow pointing up. The head is superior to the abdomen, right? So it's up, it's above. The head is above the abdomen, so it's superior to it. So that's one way to think of course, what superior is, up, above. So you're seeing this, you look here, this is anatomical, the way, standard anatomical form. Remember, you've got this body is erect, you've got your feet slightly apart, you've got your palms facing forward, and your thumbs are pointing away from the body. Up would be at the, anything above or higher up in that. So the head, again, is superior to the abdomen. Inferior, or caudal, that is away from the head or towards the lower part of the structure or below. So the navel is inferior to the chin. And remember, this is viewing it from standard anatomical position, right? Then, of course, we have anterior or ventral. Okay, so this is interesting because you'll see this little asterisk next to it, and there's a little note for you. The terms ventral and anterior are synonymous in humans, but if you want to go to vet school or study anything with, four-legged animals, they are not. So basically, anterior and ventral will be different in animals that have four legs or have a different structure than a bipedal system, right? So basically here in anatomy and physiology, we're specifically talking about humans. So basically this anterior and ventral are the same, but that's not always the case in other animals. So keep that in mind. But we're only focusing on humans in here, so it doesn't matter. But if you do end up going into vet school or any kind of other, you're interested in biology and you want to go into mammalian physiology, you'll see some differences. But for this class, it's the same. So that's toward or at the front of the body or in front of, right? So again, you're looking, basically the breastbone is anterior to the spine. Then you have posterior and dorsal. This is the same. In humans, they are the same. In four-legged animals, if you were talking about something else, those would be different. But for our purposes in this class, since we're talking about humans, posterior and dorsal are the same. That's towards or at the back of the body or behind. So the heart is posterior to the breastbone. You're looking this way on an anatomical form, right? So those are some of the basic ones. These are some of the easier ones to remember. My suggestion to you is to go through these individually. Have these memorized. Stop this recording here or stop and memorize these before you move any further. That will help you later because we'll keep referring to this later. And if I say something is superior to something or something is posterior or anterior, I'm not going to stop and explain what anterior is all the time. I might a couple of times just to help you, but that won't always be the case. So memorize those. Medial. That's towards the midline. That one's kind of an easy one to remember because you could think medium in the middle, medial. So that's towards the midline of the body or on the inner side. The heart is medial to the arm. Lateral, that's away from the midline. So that's on sort of the outer side. So basically the arms are lateral to the chest. So if you remember, look in basic anatomical position. And you're going away from the midline. Intermediate. So that's between a more medial and a more lateral structure. Okay, so again, in anatomical position, the collarbone is intermediate between the breastbone and the shoulder. So if you hear intermediate, of course, you're looking that way. So those are three more. Again, stop here and, making sure you understand these features so that you can utilize those as we go on. Some others. So there's a lot of terminology to memorize before we get into these systems, right? Proximal. Proximal is basically closer to the origin of the body part or the point of attachment of a limb. So to the body or the trunk, right? So again, anatomical position. The elbow is proximal to the wrist. So if you see proximal, that's how it's utilized. Distal, that's farther away from the origin of the body part, right? And so you might see something like the knee is distal to the thigh. Superficial also means external. So that's towards or at the body surface. So the skin is superficial to skeletal muscles because it's on the surface. And then deep or internal, that's away from the body surface. So that's more internal structures. So the lungs are deep to the skin. So that's basically those kinds of orientations and directional terms there. There are also regional terms. So there's two main divisions in the body that we'll be talking about as we go through anatomy. So you've got your axial. Your axial is considered your head, neck, and trunk. And then you have the appendicular. And those are the limbs. That's the legs and the arms. So this, when we talk about different parts of the body, we're going to have some axial and appendicular regions as well. Regional terms sort of designate specific areas within body divisions. So you might see when we talk about the skeletal system coming up in a couple weeks, we'll talk a lot about axial and appendicular. We'll have those terms a lot. And so you'll see that. But those are regional terms. But here's some other regional terms for specific body areas. You might have the term cephalic, which has a frontal, orbital, nasal, buccal, and oral, and then, of course, the medial. You have cervical area, which is right here. Don't confuse the cervical area with the cervix. So that's something that some people do. You think you've heard of cervix. That's going to be in the reproductive system. But the cervical area is right here in your neck. You have a cervical vertebra right in your neck region. So that's the cervical area. You have the thoracic. And, of course, you have mammary, axillary, sternal, abdominal and the umbilical region, the pelvic region, lower limbs with different divisions there as well. Manus, which is the hand with different regions. And then your limbs as well. So make sure that you understand these regional terms as well. Like I said, when we talk about some body systems, they're going to be more prevalent than other body systems when we get to those areas. Here's, of course, others, the back with the upper limb and sort of what that looks like. You got your vertical, your lumbar, your gluteal area, and, of course, again, your cephalic area that we talked about before. So you're going to see these as we kind of travel through each of the body systems. Another important thing that you need to know is body plane. So a few slides ago, I said something to the effect of some people have more struggles with trying to get body orientation than others. Like I said, dyslexia is one of them that makes it very challenging to understand the planes and the sections because you have to visualize the body cut, right? So one of the things that we'll kind of talk about is these body planes. That's the surfaces along the body or even structures that may be cut for anatomical study. There are three very common planes, right? So you've got the sagittal plane, the frontal plane, and the transverse plane. And then, of course, we have sections, and I'll show you images of this in a minute, but we have sections as well. These are cuts or sections made along a body plane. So these are named after the plane. So basically, a sagittal cut is basically results in a sagittal section. So your sections are named after the body plane that based on how that structure may be cut. So the sagittal plane divides the body vertically into right and left parts. Okay, so that produces what we call a sagittal section if cut along this plane. Mid-sagittal or median plane is a cut perfectly on the midline. Parasagittal plane is off-centered, not on the midline. So a lot of times you're going to see these different views. You're going to have this mid-sagittal plane where that cut is perfectly down the middle, or you're going to have this parasagittal. You might have off the side cut. So we're going to see those, especially when we talk about different body systems. We also have frontal planes, that of course, that frontal plane that divides the body vertically into its anterior and posterior parts, front and back. So remember those earlier positions we talked about, and I said, stop there and learn those. They're going to become, basically combine to help us understand these planes, right? So this produces the frontal or the coronal section in the body. The transverse, or otherwise known as horizontal plane, divides the body horizontally 90 degrees to the vertical plane. This is into superior and inferior parts, top and bottom. So make sure you understand when we talk about superior and inferior, that transverse plane is what's going to divide that. That produces a cross section. So if you want to see something like a cross section, transverse plane will do that. Oblique section. That results of a cut at an angle other than 90 degrees to the vertical plane. So these different planes are really important, especially when we're looking at anatomical features. So here's some of the cuts or the planes of the body, looking at them under magnetic resonance imaging or MRI scans. Okay, so you can see here, basically you have this, I'm going to start with the frontal here. You got this frontal plane. You see that cut that happens in that frontal area. You see this transverse, so when you have this cut here, and then of course this medium, basically dividing those two halves together. So basically you could see that sort of dividing that into anterior and posterior, and then of course dividing things into superior and inferior areas. We also have dorsal and ventral body cavities, and each of the dorsal and ventral body cavities have each of their own subdivision. You have the dorsal body cavity that contains the cranial cavity, which holds the brain, and the vertebral cavity that holds the spinal cord. You have a thoracic cavity that contains the heart and the lungs, the abdominal cavity that contains the digestive viscera, the pelvic cavity that contains the bladder, the reproductive systems, the rectum, things like that. So each of these bodies have different functions. Each of these cavities have different subcavities that hold different parts of organs or organ systems. So each one of those dorsal and ventral body cavities has subdivisions that contain those different organs. Now, here's one thing that happens when we think about applying anatomy and physiology together. Problems occur when structures stray into neighboring cavities. An example of this is the hiatal hernia that some people experience. So if you think of a hiatal hernia, very painful. Basically, part of the stomach is protruding into the diaphragm, through the diaphragm, into that thoracic cavity. So that can push stomach acid into the esophagus, which causes irritation. We refer to this as heartburn. Stomach acid is equivalent to hydrochloric acid. It has a pH of about 2. It's very, very acidic. Your stomach can maintain that stomach acid. It's designed that way. It has this mucus layer that is impenetrable to hydrochloric acid. But if you start having some of that stomach protrude through the diaphragm into the thoracic cavity, all of a sudden this hydrochloric acid and this digestive enzymes are in an area that it shouldn't be. And there's not that mucous membrane, and it starts burning or causing pain to those other tissues. In severe cases, you have to have surgical repair of this. So when we have these like dorsal and ventral body cavities and each of their subdivisions, and I say a certain organ or certain structure stays in this area, it can get out of whack. Problems can occur if they stray into neighboring cavities. There's lots of different examples, and we'll talk about them throughout the semester. Hiatal hernia is the easiest one to kind of mention because some people have experienced that before. Maybe even if it's not major, you might have some minor experience with that. We also have serous membranes that we think about and the relationships to those. And so basically, these are basically little sacs that is almost like a balloon that is sort of puts a barrier between the organs and organ systems. So here's an example of heart. The heart has a serous membrane. We have a pericardium and then pericardial space that is part of that. And so the pericardium is kind of like the serous membrane. It can serve as a protection mechanism. However, the serous membrane can become inflamed if you have an infection or some other problem. So what happens is the normal smooth layers of that serous membrane become rough and can even create a sticky substance where they stick together, and this causes excruciating pain. Pleurisy and periodontitis is some of that, some of the things that can happen. So you can have infection of these and it can cause serious problems. Another structural area that we could talk about is the 4 quadrants, or the abdominopelvic quadrants. And remember, you have to look at this in that standard anatomical position, feet slightly apart, facing upright, hands pointed outwards with the thumbs pointed away from the body. When you look at a body that way, there's these 4 quadrants that you can see here. You have the upper right quadrant, or I should say the right upper quadrant, the left upper quadrant, the lower left quadrant, and the right lower quadrant. These are noted by these symbols. RUQ is the right upper quadrant, LUQ is the left upper quadrant, and so on and so forth. So if you're looking at a medical chart or you're reading something, somebody is not going to take the time to write all this out, right? We're going to abbreviate it. So make sure you not only understand these positions and what they are, but understand the acronyms or the letters that we use to symbolize those. Within these abdominopelvic quadrants, we also have these abdominopelvic regions, and there's 9 of those. So you can kind of see that here. We have epigastric regions and umbilical regions and pubic regions. So you can see these 9 different regions here. In each of those 9 different regions, we have certain components in those. Again, looking at normal anatomical position, basically in, let's use the umbilical region. In that umbilical region, you see that there's a transverse colon of the large intestine should be located there. The descending colon would be in another area. And so these quadrants contain parts of the body that we know should be there, right? Now, I will say, and it's probably not as big for this class, but if you're going into medical school, you're going into nursing, especially if you're going into any surgical side, you'll notice that not everybody's internal organs are exactly the same. There's some slight variation to it. There's also fat that surrounds these organs as well, which can create, movement. Like your heart might have fat around it. Everybody's heart has some fat around it, but people who are overweight will have more fat. People who are not as overweight will have less fat. And so that will shift where some of these things are a little, but they still should lay in the general quadrant. But it may not look as perfect as you see in this cartoon-like image that we have here. There's some other body cavities too to be aware of. We have things like those that are exposed to the environment, those that are not. So basically, if these smaller cavities that are exposed to the environment are things like our oral and digestive cavities, our nasal cavity, our orbital cavities, middle ear cavities, and those that are not exposed to the environment are things like the synovial cavities. Those are things like joints and joint cavities, those that are found in those. So those are some other body cavities that you may come across. So basically, just want to kind of remind you guys that to go through all the material that's provided, the notes, the PowerPoints, and of course, if you're hearing this, you're viewing the lecture now, but do make sure you utilize all the resources. There are tons of information that are available to you, but the biggest thing is if you have questions or you need help, I'm happy to help. I'm here to help, so just reach out to me, but I will see you in the next chapter, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day.